Turkey is gathering its top officials, military and political, for an emergency summit after a day of chaos, bloodshed and confusion on its border with Iraq. Turkey says 12 of its soldiers were killed in an ambush by Kurdish fighters. The Kurdish fighters, the PKK, say they killed even more and are now holding other soldiers hostage. In the hours since, there's been an explosion on a minibus in southeastern Turkey, which has killed at least one. And Turkey has been shelling villages in the mountains. About 4 hours from now, Turkey's Prime Minister, President and military generals will meet at the presidential palace in Ankara. But Prime Minister Erdogan has made his position clear, saying, "Our anger, our hatred is great." And these were the scenes in the southeastern Turkish town of Erzurum a short time ago. Tens of thousands of Turks taking to the streets, holding the Turkish flag and chanting, "Turkey cannot be divided." We'll go live to the border in a moment, but first, Sebastian Walker on the developments so far.
Latest pictures from a bad situation that's just got a lot worse. This is the rescue operation after what Turkish sources say is yet another attack on Turkish soil by Kurdish rebel fighters. These are victims of a landmine explosion that hit a minibus driving near the Iraqi border. And just hours earlier, Turkish television broke news of an even more deadly attack. The report said PKK fighters had raided Turkish military positions near the Iraqi border with significant loss of life. Ankara says there were losses on both sides during fighting they said took place in the Hakkari province in southeast Turkey. The PKK, which has thousands of fighters in northern Iraq, say they've taken several Turkish troops hostage. It's a ramping up of tensions that will seriously worry Iraqi Kurdish leaders. But speaking at a press conference in northern Iraq, they stated their defiance.
If we are directly affected by the conflict or Kurdistan province is directly targeted, we will no doubt defend ourselves.
Turkish military actions looked increasingly likely over recent days, the country's parliament giving the go-ahead last Wednesday. But these latest attacks could be the last straw for Ankara's forces, and the last chance gone for anybody hoping a full-scale Turkish incursion into northern Iraq can be averted. Sebastian Walker, Al Jazeera.
Ahead of the emergency security meeting in Ankara, the Turkish President Abdullah Gül has been stressing the importance of decisive action against the PKK.
I'd like to stress the fact that being determinate, wise and considerate is very important in the way we follow from this point onwards. I've invited the government and our commanders. We will assess the situation. And tomorrow I've invited the heads of all the political parties for a meeting. The whole nation should be united in this matter. We should not damage our feelings of brotherhood and sisterhood. To weaken such feelings in our country is the first aim of terrorism. Therefore, I'd like to draw the attention of all my citizens that we should unite and act in unity and togetherness against this terrible curse we are facing. And we should be behind our armed forces and also never let people damage the connections of solidarity between our nation.
Dear President Barzani said something, if Turkey does an operation, we have a self-defense right.
Look, let me say this. Never ask me questions about such persons from this point onwards. Who I will address should be known, and he is not one of them. Turkey gives more importance to the unity of Iraq. Turkey has no interest in the lands of Iraq at all, but if Iraq continues to shelter the terrorists, Turkey has a legal entitlement to destroy that shelter, and we are determined to do that, and our Grand National Assembly has authorized us to do so.
And our correspondent Barnaby Phillips is in Silopi on the Turkish side of the border with Iraq. Barnaby, we've seen those demonstrations in Erzurum in eastern Anatolia. We've heard Prime Minister Erdogan saying our anger, our hatred is great. Just how much pressure is the government under in order to crack down on the PKK?
I think almost intolerable pressure, Imran. If you remember a similar incident a fortnight ago in which about a dozen Turkish soldiers were killed, that was followed by enormous funerals which became very political events. The Turkish media for days afterwards broadcast those funerals, referred to the soldiers who had been killed as martyrs. Their names were read out at important football matches. There was a huge momentum, fueled in some part by the Turkish media, and that led, of course, to that vote in Parliament on Wednesday, which authorized a military incursion. I expect in the days ahead we'll see a similar kind of outpouring of anger, pushing from the opposition parties, the nationalist opposition parties, pushing from some parts of the military, all concentrating on Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan and President Abdullah Gül. And I think it will be very difficult for them to resist that pressure if they were inclined to do so.
Do you think that Turkey has been making some very nuanced responses, particularly to the issue of the missing soldiers?
Turkey officially is not talking about missing soldiers. There was a terse statement from the Turkey Army Command this afternoon in which it referred to its fatalities, its injuries. It talked about PKK terrorists, as it calls them, sneaking across the border from northern Iraq, making it clear where they think the origin of the problem lies. And it said that the Turkish army had responded with greater force and had killed, I think, something like 23 PKK fighters, and that the conflict was still going on in that area. Very difficult for us to confirm that independently, by the way, because the Turkish military is not allowing journalists anywhere near. But they are not mentioning captured soldiers. That doesn't mean that there have not been captured soldiers. They may be hiding or holding that information back.
And a new statement from the PKK leadership to us in the past hour or so, saying that the Turkish military did not cross into northern Iraq, seems to have added a little bit of a twist to the scenario. Do you think that that vindicates the Turkish military's position?
Well, I think both sides are trying to maximize this for the propaganda potential. But I think that does put a twist if you are receiving that statement from the PKK. That, on the face of it, is an implicit admission from the PKK, perhaps, that they crossed over into southern Turkey. It almost seems like a provocative act to do, but it would possibly put Turkey in this particular incident on the moral high ground, because if it had been a case where Turkish troops had crossed over into northern Iraq, well, you could argue in that case that Turkey had arguably provoked this particular incident.
Barnaby Phillips, good work there in Silopi. A very fluid situation. We'll be hearing from you a little bit later on. Thank you very much. Iraqi President Jalal Talabani is ordering the PKK fighters to lay down their arms or leave Iraq. But he has also refused to hand over the group's leaders to Turkey. Our Iraq correspondent Huda Abdel Hamid explains why.
To hand over the PKK leaders who are based here in northern Iraq is an incredibly difficult mission, because it means going after them in these mountains, which is an extremely rugged area, and they are scattered all over their mountains, and they don't have big bases where you can easily spot them. They know the terrain better than anyone else, and going after them is just, from what everybody says here, and just an impossible mission.
Now, hundreds of kilometers south in Iraq, a U.S. raid is causing anger in Baghdad. U.S. forces say they've killed 49 people they describe as criminals. But witnesses say civilians, including children, were among the victims in the ground and air attacks on the Shia stronghold of Sadr city. James Bays reports.
This is what was left behind after a U.S. raid in Sadr city. It's believed 13 people died, more than 69 were injured. There was a fierce firefight as US forces entered the heavily populated Shia neighborhood. The Americans say they came to arrest a man wanted for heading a high-profile kidnapping gang. They say they came under fire with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades being used against them. They called in air support, and local people say it was those airstrikes that caused many of the casualties. They say many of those who died were civilians. A man shows a blood-stained mattress where 2 children were killed. He says the youngsters were his relatives. At the nearest hospital, some of the injured are being treated, children again among the casualties. The cameraman also filmed the bodies of the 2 dead children lying in the hospital. Those pictures are too distressing for us to show. Later, the bodies of the youngsters were carried through the streets. Anger